Between 1932 and 1933, one of the greatest tragedies in human history unfolded in silence. In Europe's most fertile fields, millions died of starvation, not from natural disasters, but from deliberate decisions. This is the story of the Holodomor, a term meaning to kill by starvation, and for decades it was denied, hidden, and forgotten. Memory of these victims by exploring how this tragedy was systematically orchestrated. You'll understand it was weaponized as a political tool, and later, I'll show you how survivors kept their stories secret for generations. This isn't just a history, it's a testament to human resilience in the face of the unthinkable. You wake up in a Ukrainian village in the winter of 19. The smell of death hangs in the frozen air. This isn't a metaphor, it's literal. Bodies of neighbors you've known since childhood lie in the street, strength left to bury them. No wood left for coffins. Your own legs shake when you try to stand. It's been 8 days since you've eaten anything but boiled tree bark and grass. Your house, well kept, now echoes empty. The firewood last month. The pots haven't seen food in weeks. You look through the broken window at fields your family has cultivated for generations. Vast, fertile, capable of feeding millions. But they're empty. Every grain has been seized by Soviet collectors. The silence of the village is haunting. Where children's laughter once filled the air, now you only hear occasional moans from shuttered houses. Entire families have vanished overnight. The school closed because there are no more children. The church was sealed by the government. You try to remember the taste of food, but your mind is foggy. Starvation isn't just physical. It devours your ability to think, to feel, to be human. Your teeth are loosening. Your skin has turned a strange yellow color, and you know you're dying slowly. But the worst part isn't the physical hunger. It's knowing that food exists. You've seen trains loaded with grain passing through the station, grain from your own land, heading to Moscow and other cities. You've heard soldiers talking about warehouses full of grain in the neighboring town, guarded by armed sentries. Each morning you still wake up is a small, bitter victory. You know it might be your last. And you know this isn't an accident of nature or an unavoidable tragedy. Someone decided you should starve to death. Someone planned this. Imagine if it were your family, your children. How would you choose who eats and who doesn't? This was the brutal reality millions of Ukrainians faced. But before we continue, I need to tell you something that will completely change how you see this story. Because what you're seeing now wasn't even close to the worst. What happened to the children was even more devastating, and in 5 minutes, I'll show you exactly how the government turned neighbors into informants. Moscow, 1932. In the corridors of the Kremlin, a decision that would kill millions is being made with the coldness of someone planning a harvest. Joseph Stalin, the man who controlled 1/6 of the Earth's surface, looks at maps of Ukraine like a general studying a battlefield. But his weapon isn't gunpowder, it's starvation. Stalin isn't just a brutal dictator, he's a calculating strategist who understands that Ukraine represents an existential threat to his project of total power. Ukrainians have their own language, culture, traditions. They resist forced collectivization. They dream of independence. For Stalin, this is unacceptable. Stalin's personality during this period reveals a man consumed by paranoia, but also by a grandiose and twisted vision of history. He sees himself as the architect of a new world order, where individual nations will disappear in favor of a monolithic Soviet state. Ukraine, with its strong national identity, is an obstacle that must be removed. The decision isn't impulsive. Declassified documents reveal meticulous meetings where Stalin and his collaborators, Molotov, Kaganovich, Postashev, discuss the technical details of extermination. They use euphemisms, resolution of the Ukrainian national question, intensification of grain quotas, discouragement of counter-revolutionary elements. Stalin wasn't born a monster. Let me show you the exact moment he crossed the line. In 1929, when the first reports of peasant resistance reached the Kremlin, Stalin still hesitated about extreme methods. But when he realized that voluntary collectivization was failing, something changed in his mindset. Documents reveal that he began to see Ukrainian peasants not as Soviet citizens, but as internal enemies who needed to be eliminated. Lazar Kaganovich, Stalin's chief enforcer in Ukraine, is sent to Kiev with precise instructions. Confiscate not only the official grain quota, but also the seeds for future planting, the grain hidden for family survival, even the wheat meant for livestock. The goal is clear: don't leave a single grain that could sustain Ukrainian life. The Soviet bureaucratic machine transforms into an instrument of death. Grain collectors receive orders to meet impossible quotas. When peasants protest that there are no more grains, collectors are instructed to search for hidden stockpiles. A fiction that justifies ransacking every house, every barn, every hole in the ground. Stalin implements draconian laws. Anyone found with hidden grain will be executed or sent to the gulags. Children are encouraged to inform on their own parents. Neighbors are turned into informants. Ukrainian society is systematically torn apart from within. While Stalin signed these orders, he didn't know he was creating evidence that would one day condemn him. Every decree, every telegram, every report would become irrefutable proof of the systematic and deliberate nature of the genocide. The most shocking aspect is the simultaneity. While Ukrainians die of starvation, Stalin orders trains loaded with Ukrainian grain to depart daily for other Soviet regions and for export. When international aid offers arrive, Stalin categorically refuses them, insisting that there is no famine in the Soviet Union. And here's the document that proves Stalin knew exactly how many would die. A confidential report from March 1933, signed by him personally, estimating population losses necessary to complete social transformation. He wasn't trying to feed his people. He was deliberately starving them to death. Imagine being the official who had to write these orders. How would you sleep at night, knowing your words would condemn millions to death? This is the banality of evil. How atrocities are committed by ordinary people following bureaucratic order. In the midst of absolute horror, something extraordinary happened. People dying of starvation found the strength to do something that defied all logic of survival. They stopped to document what was happening. They knew the world would need to know the truth. Gareth Jones, a young Welsh journalist, managed to enter Ukraine clandestinely in 1933. His notes, written in code and hidden in his clothes, revealed what he saw. I walked through villages where there wasn't a single living being, not even dogs. The houses stood open, with mummified bodies still sitting at empty tables. But the real heroes of this story are the Ukrainians themselves who risked their lives to preserve testimonies. In secret attics, families hid handwritten diaries. Dying mothers whispered to their children, "Remember what happened here. Tell your children." A recent archaeological discovery in a village near Kiev revealed buried glass jars containing letters written by a family during the worst months of the famine. The letters, preserved for 90 years, describe in detail how grain collectors arrived at houses. They searched even under the floorboards. They took even the sunflower seeds I had saved to plant in spring. But how did this evidence survive when Stalin ordered everything to be destroyed? The mystery that intrigues historians is how so much evidence survived decades of systematic Soviet repression. The NKVD, Soviet secret police, had specific orders to destroy any documents related to the Holodomor. Historical cleansing operations swept through archives, libraries, and private homes. Evidence points to a secret network that functioned as a sophisticated cultural resistance system. Ukrainians developed a clandestine network for preserving memory. Documents were hand-copied and distributed among trusted families. Photographs were hidden in double walls. Oral testimonies were transmitted from generation to generation through coded lullabies and seemingly folkloric stories. One of the most impactful discoveries came from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church archives. Priests, at risk of execution, maintained secret death records. These clandestine books of the dead were hidden in abandoned churches and destroyed monasteries. When they were discovered in the 1990s, they revealed numbers that confirmed historians' worst estimates. The resistance wasn't just documentary. Family networks developed ingenious systems of mutual survival. Orphaned children were secretly adopted by other families, even when those families barely had food for themselves. Food was hidden in impossible places, inside walls, buried in cemeteries, even inside animal carcasses. But how did this evidence survive when Stalin ordered everything to be destroyed? The mystery that intrigues historians is how so much evidence survived, decades of systematic Soviet repression. What would you do if you knew that documenting this would cost your life? This was the choice thousands of Ukrainians made. They chose truth over survival. Perhaps the most powerful act of resistance was the preservation of Ukrainian language and culture. In clandestine schools, held in basements and barns, teachers continued teaching children to read and write in Ukrainian, knowing that being discovered meant certain death. A fascinating theory suggests that the word Holodomor itself was created as a code of resistance. Combining holod, hunger, with mor, death, plague, they created a term that instantly communicated the artificial and deliberate nature of the tragedy, differentiating it from natural famines. Imagine opening a jar buried 90 years ago and finding a letter, written by hands trembling with hunger, but still determined to leave a testimony for posterity. This is what archaeologists have repeatedly found in excavations across Ukraine. And then, in 1991, they discovered something no one expected in the Vatican archives: secret correspondence between Ukrainian priests and Rome, describing the genocide in details that had been hidden for 60 years. The Church knew, the world knew, but chose silence. While millions died in Ukraine, something equally shocking was happening in the elegant salons of London, Paris, and New York. The world knew and chose to remain silent. Walter Duranty, the New York Times correspondent in Moscow, was winning a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on Soviet modernization. His articles described collectivization as a brilliant success, categorically denying any famine in Ukraine. What the public didn't know was that Duranty had a secret deal with the Soviet government: privileged access in exchange for favorable propaganda. In his private telegrams to editors, discovered decades later, Duranty wrote, "The situation is much worse than I can report. But if I tell the truth, I'll lose access and won't be able to work here anymore." This journalistic hypocrisy cost millions of lives, because Duranty's reports were cited by world leaders to justify inaction. While Ukrainians died of starvation, Stalin dined on caviar at 12-course banquets. The contrast with the Soviet elite is devastating. While Ukrainians ate tree bark, the apartments of the nomenklatura in Moscow overflowed with imported luxury. Declassified archives reveal that Stalin and his collaborators dined on caviar and French champagne while discussing grain quotas that would condemn entire villages. Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's right-hand man, kept a personal diary, discovered in 1998, where he wrote about his concerns with the Ukrainian problem. A March 1933 entry says, "The measures are working better than we expected. Cultural resistance is visibly diminishing." He was celebrating genocide as an administrative victory. The international hypocrisy was equally brutal. Franklin Roosevelt officially recognized the Soviet Union in 1933, exactly during the peak of the Holodomor. American diplomats in Kiev sent detailed reports about the famine to Washington, but these reports were classified and filed away. Foreign policy was more important than human lives. George Bernard Shaw, the famous Irish writer, visited the Soviet Union in 1932 and returned publicly declaring that he saw no evidence of famine. Private documents reveal that Shaw was taken only to model farms, with carefully staged scenarios. But even when confronted with later evidence, Shaw never admitted to being deceived. The same journalists who won prizes denying the famine knew the truth. The Catholic Church knew through Ukrainian priests who managed to send clandestine letters to the Vatican. Pope Pius XI received detailed reports about systematic extermination through starvation. But the Vatican opted for silent diplomacy, fearing reprisals against Catholics in other Soviet countries. An archival discovery from 2003 revealed that the International Red Cross had detailed plans for humanitarian aid missions in Ukraine, but abandoned them after political pressure from the Soviet Union and Western countries that didn't want to complicate diplomatic relations. The most perverse aspect was Soviet propaganda aimed at the outside world. Documentary films showed prosperous Ukrainian farms, with well-fed actors playing happy peasants. These productions were shown in Western cinemas as evidence of Soviet prosperity. And you know where this is happening today? Let me show you the parallels. Modern authoritarian regimes still use hunger as a political weapon, still control narratives through propaganda, still rely on international complicity through convenient silence. Even Western progressive intellectuals participated in the cover-up. Lincoln Steffens, a respected American journalist, wrote, "I have seen the future, and it works." He was referring directly to the Soviet model, even having received reports about the Ukrainian famine. The breaking of silence only began in the 1980s, when Mikhail Gorbachev initiated glasnost. Suddenly, archives were opened, witnesses could speak, and the magnitude of the horror became undeniable. But it still took decades for the Holodomor to be internationally recognized as genocide. Finally, in 1991, when the archives were opened, the truth emerged like an avalanche of evidence that had been carefully preserved by courageous survivors. In 2006, Ukraine secured approval of a resolution in the European Parliament recognizing the Holodomor as genocide. Today, 16 countries officially recognize this classification, but Russia still denies it was genocide, classifying it as a common tragedy that affected the entire Soviet Union. But this story doesn't end here. The fight for memory continues, and you can be part of it. Every time we share these stories, every time we refuse to forget, every time we demand truth from our leaders, we're honoring the memory of those who died and preventing future atrocities from being forgotten. The Holodomor teaches us that genocides don't happen overnight. They're built gradually, with complicity, silence, and indifference. But it also teaches us that truth, even when buried for decades, eventually emerges through the courage of those who refuse to forget. The question that remains is, how can we ensure that atrocities like this are never forgotten? The answer lies in each of us. Share this story. Question official narratives. Demand transparency from your leaders. And never accept silence when it comes to injustice. If this story impacted you, you need to know about another genocide that was silenced for decades. In the next video in our Forgotten Genocides series, we'll dive into the Armenian tragedy of 1915. Another example of how the world can choose to remain silent in the face of horror. This is the first part of our series on genocides that were systematically denied and forgotten. Stay with us on this journey for historical truth, because only by knowing our past can we build a more just future. Remember, memory is a weapon against the repetition of history. Use it.